All right, good afternoon, class. We'll get right after this. I'm going to continue along with the review session that we began in class today. I have a handful more of questions that I'd like to explore and maybe help you continue to familiarize yourself with the material as we approach tomorrow's exam. Pardon me. So we left off, I think we were talking about the gold rush and Carolyn Merchant's analysis of race, class, and gender, and how that applies to the varied experiences of different social groups that were part of the California gold rush. And then we know that, moving ahead, we know that in the last decade of the 19th century, the United States begins to have some pretty powerful symbolism that the past century or so of easy land and dramatic expansion are now coming to a close. And Frederick Jackson Turner is among the voices. He writes a very revealing essay called On the Significance of the Frontier in American History. He uses 1890 census data, and in 1893 he writes this. And my question here is, how is it both a progressive and a declensionist narrative? Perhaps you already know that, but it's important to note that in the thesis, in this essay, what Turner is arguing is that it's been the frontier experience, the experience that various generations of homesteaders and migrants who've moved from east to west to arrive on the frontier of the United States. It's that process. The frontier is a process whereby the basic American character is formed, that the challenges and difficulties that confront the individual who is trying to create something out of nothing, or at least a disorganized equivalent of nothing, that it's that process that teaches self-reliance, self-sufficiency, resourcefulness, freedom, independence, the willingness to struggle and fight to survive. That all those things, all those values that are deeply held by Americans are explained through that process of the frontier. Now, it's also a declensionist narrative in the sense that, and by declensionist we mean a downward sloping narrative, a narrative that might have a sobering or unhappy ending. And it's declensionist in the sense that now that the frontier is quote-unquote closed, what does that mean for the future of Americans? Are they still going to be able to learn and practice and model those bedrock values that have become synonymous with America and Americans? So, there you go. In a somewhat related manner, we also talked, and you read an excerpt from Walter Prescott Webb's The Great Plains. And in it, Webb is essentially making the case that, once again, Americans are exceptional, that there's something unique about the character of Americans. And this isn't all that different from Turner's thesis and his explanation, although Webb makes the case that, there's sort of a material explanation that the American settlers onto the plains had a tremendous obstacle to overcome. And similar to Turner, it is a matter of really the frontier being a process. But for Webb, the process is a little more concrete in the sense that he's crediting the American ingenuity and innovation, the fact that Americans adapt and utilize new tools to account for the fact that rainfall and humidity becomes real scarce as one proceeds west across the American plains. The 99th or 100th meridian is essentially that line of rainfall where you have, when you get west of that line, you have 20 inches or less of annual rainfall, and that becomes a critical cutoff. That's where agriculture starts to become unfeasible. And so how do these Americans adapt, improvise, and overcome the challenges? Well, they invent revolvers, and they invent windmills that bring water up from underground wells. They invent barbed wire, which allows people to protect their private property, and particularly to protect it from grazing animals. They invent tractors, which allow them to use fossil fuels to more aggressively and more intensively work the soil, and allow it to provide more despite the harsh circumstances. Now, the problem with Webb's thesis, or his explanation, is that, of course, just a few years after it's published, the United States goes through one of its greatest environmental catastrophes ever, and that is the Dust Bowl. And Webb clearly wasn't anticipating this horrific chapter in American history when he wrote his book, The Great Plains. And many environmentalists and climatologists have reached the conclusion that it was actually some of those innovations that Webb celebrates that probably indirectly contributed and caused the Dust Bowl, and allowed for the mass migration of considerable amounts of American topsoil to blow from west to east in the 1930s. So, there you go. All right, how would you describe the difference between Jefferson's subsistence farmer and Sinclair, or Upton Sinclair's meat packing plant laborer? Well, this question is just intended to get you thinking about how different the United States had become in, say, the 100 years between the late 1700s and then the late 1800s. And I think if you take a snapshot of that subsistence farmer in a New England forest trying to take down trees so that they can plant parts of their property and etch out a subsistence, a living that will allow them to survive, that's a very different person than that immigrant who's working in the factory of the Chicago stockyards. And I really raised that just to get you thinking about that dramatic transformation that the transportation and market revolutions bring about. And if you want to explain them, I think that's really what we're looking at, is that American society's economy has dramatically transformed from subsistence to market-based behavior, which is shortly followed by industrialization. And in that process, you have essentially individuals who are shifting from that primary sort of independent style of survival to a now really interdependent, maybe even vulnerable reliance upon the new mode of production, which is capitalist industrialization. And in some ways that's a story that's, in some ways, depending on how you look at it, that's a progressive story. Other ways it's a declensionist story. It kind of depends on how you look at it. And if you look at the role that the American environment plays in that transformation, you really are going to see a whole nother level, a whole nother scale of environmental impact that comes with this industrial mode of production, as opposed to the previous subsistence mode. Now we have exchange value clearly trumping that of use value. Okay, and to suburbia, what is wrong with the suburb as a model of American settlement? Well, as the rather, I think you could say, opinionated and maybe even biased, I think you'd certainly have to conclude that they're biased, the people who put together the documentary End of Suburbia. At the same time, they're also, pointing out some, what I would say are some fairly sound truths about the history of the American suburb. Their thesis, or their opinion on this, is that the suburb is essentially a waste of fossil fuels. It's incredibly dependent upon fossil fuels. People commute from the suburb to get to work. Generally speaking, the American suburb has gone hat in hand with the American love affair of the automobile. And when you have individuals driving to their place of work, or their school, or their campus, or what have you, there's a real loss of efficiency. In the pre-suburban period of American history, people wouldn't travel quite so far to work. and they would generally travel in a manner that had fewer consequences and required fewer fossil fuels. So the complaint or concern that's being registered in this story is essentially that the suburb is built on a unsustainable and unresourceful premise. And I think it's worth saying that these gentlemen would probably be a little bit surprised by the alternative, what appears to be a movement toward natural gas, which might buy greater time for American fossil fuel resources. Doesn't necessarily change whether or not the suburban design of mid-20th century American history is a wise one. I think the producers of this documentary would probably still disagree with it. Okay, so, is that it? No. Okay, following terms. I want you to be familiar with some of these terms. We talked a lot about America's period of easy land, all that public domain that existed out there in the American West, and there were a number of terms that came along with it. And disposition is really the manner in which land is disposed of, or the manner in which land is distributed to different people. Reservation refers to when the United States government, could also be a state government, when it reserves or keeps the land for itself. So, of course, some of the land that the public domain of the United States included or consisted of has been reserved in the form of things like national parks, U.S. forest land, like Forest Service lands, of course, wilderness. Sometimes there's just national landmarks, like, for example, the Whitman Mission is a Forest Service, something they reserved. Okay. Speculation refers to when people try to use land as a means of investment, and if you speculate, you hold land, you don't use the land, you just try to hold it for a period of time until it appreciates or becomes more valuable, and then you sell it. There were people who tried to speculate even during the easy land periods of, say, the Homestead Act, and they would do this by a process known as commutation, the next term, where you hire someone to file a claim, say under the Homestead Act, and then you pay them money to have that land then transferred into your ownership. And perhaps you would do this so that you could take their 160 acres and you could hold it for a time as an investment and then sell it, in which case you would be speculating, and you would be speculating through the benefit of a process known as commutation, having that land transferred from someone else's possession, in this case to yours. Okay, so those are some good terms to know. What were some management issues raised in the early years in the national parks? Well, the documentary that we watched probably raised a few good points, but one of the most, I think, important was that there was very little resource or strategy put forth to preserve and take care of the lands that had just recently been formed as national parks. And so this meant, in the early days, one of the ways that they would give consequences to shepherds, people who are sheep herders, is that they would, evacuate their herds out the near portion of the park to get them out of there so they wouldn't be grazing in the delicate grasses of the park, and then they would take the person who herded the sheep herder, and deposit him outside the other side. But even the U.S. military was brought on board to try to manage the park, so it's a good example of how there was an effort to do something, but there weren't the resources that were promised along with it. I'm going to skip this one and then close here just briefly. Hetchy reveals the controversy, conservation and preservation. I'm going to leave this to you, but I think you could probably answer this, right? Hetchy probably pit very effectively conservationists against preservationists, and I'll let you fill in the blanks of that one. All right, There we go. We'll see you tomorrow for our exam. Good luck.